I was sitting at my own dining table when my son suddenly pointed toward the front door and said, "Apologize to my wife or get out." I looked at him in silence, trying to understand how the little boy who once held my hand could speak to me like that. His wife, Claire, stood beside him with her arms crossed, waiting for me to lower my head. But I had nothing to apologize for. 10 minutes earlier, I had only told Claire that my grandson should not be taught to lie and blame other people for his mistakes. She immediately shouted, "You are useless. Mind your own business." I calmly told her that I was only trying to teach my grandson the values my late wife had taught our family. That was when my son slammed his hand on the table. "Enough, Dad. You always think you know better than everyone. Apologize to Claire right now, or leave this house." I looked around the room I had paid for years ago, remembering how many times I had helped my son when he had nothing. I had never asked him to repay me. I had only wanted my family to respect one another. I slowly stood up. "If that is what you want, I will leave." My son smiled, thinking he had won. I picked up my coat and walked toward the door. But before I reached it, I stopped and took out my phone. My son frowned. "Who are you calling?" I looked at him and quietly answered, "My lawyer." He laughed. "For what?" I did not answer. I simply walked outside. Less than 15 minutes later, my lawyer called me back. His voice was serious. "Mr. Harper, I have reviewed the property documents. You should not go back inside that house." I stopped beside my car. "Why?" There was a short silence before he said, "Because the house is still legally yours, and I think your son has forgotten who actually owns it." I stood beside my car, still trying to process what my lawyer had told me. "The house is legally yours?" I asked. He replied, "Yes. Your son has been living there because you allowed him to. But you never transferred ownership." I closed my eyes for a moment. I had bought that house years ago, when my son was struggling financially, and I had allowed him and Claire to live there after they got married. I never imagined that one day they would use that same home to tell me to get out. My lawyer, James, continued, "There is something else you need to know. Your son recently contacted a real estate company about selling the property." My stomach tightened. "He tried to sell my house?" James said, "He did more than try. He provided documents claiming that he was the owner." I looked back toward the house. My son was standing behind the window, watching me. He probably thought I had called my lawyer because I was angry. He had no idea what was coming. I asked James to send me everything he had found. A few minutes later, several documents appeared on my phone. One of them showed my son's signature beside a statement claiming that I had permanently given him the property. It was completely false. I had never signed anything like that. I called James immediately. "Can he really sell the house with these documents?" He answered, "Not legally, but someone may have helped him create them." That sentence made me stop. "Someone?" I asked. James lowered his voice. "Yes, and I think you should come to my office tonight. There is another document connected to your family that you need to see." I asked what it was, but he refused to explain over the phone. Then, just before hanging up, he said, "Bring the original documents your wife left behind. I believe they may explain why your son suddenly wants this." "How so badly?" I looked at my phone, then back at the mansion. For the first time, I wondered if this argument had never really been about Claire at all. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, carrying the small folder of documents my late wife had left behind. James was waiting for me when I arrived, and the moment I sat down, he locked the office door. "I did not want to discuss this over the phone," he said. He opened the folder and placed an old document on the table. I recognized my wife's handwriting immediately. It was a letter she had written shortly before she passed away. I began reading, but after the first few lines, my hands started shaking. She had written about our son, Daniel, and something she had discovered before her death. "If Daniel ever tries to take control of the house, do not fight him emotionally. There is something he does not know." I looked at James. "What does this mean?" He opened another file. Inside were property records showing that my wife had placed the house into a protected family trust years earlier. I was the only person with authority to manage it. Daniel could live there, but he could never sell it, borrow against it, or claim ownership. I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. My wife had apparently seen something coming that I never noticed. Then James showed me something even more disturbing. Daniel had recently taken out a large private loan using the house as supposed collateral. He has already borrowed money against your property, James said. And if the lender discovers the truth, your son could face serious legal consequences. I stared at the document, unable to believe it. Daniel had not simply thrown me out. He had been secretly using my house to solve a financial problem. I asked James how much he had borrowed. He hesitated before answering. Almost $3 million. My heart sank. Where did he get that kind of debt? James turned another page toward me. The name of the company was printed at the top. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Claire's family. Then James said something that made everything suddenly make sense. I think your son did not ask you to apologize because of the argument. He needed you out of the house before the lender discovered who actually owned it. I looked at James and asked, so Claire's family gave Daniel $3 million against my house? He nodded. That is what the records suggest. But there is something even worse. He opened another file and showed me several messages between Daniel and Claire's father. They had been discussing the property for months. Their plan was simple. Convince me to leave, make Daniel appear to be the owner, sell the house, repay the loan, and keep whatever money remained. I felt my chest tighten. This was not a family argument anymore. It was a plan to take something that belonged to me. James pointed to one message dated 3 weeks earlier. Daniel had written, "Once Dad is out, everything will be easier." I read that sentence twice. My own son had been planning my removal long before he stood at the dining table and ordered me to apologize. Then James placed another document in front of me. There is one reason their plan has not worked yet. I asked what he meant. He explained that the family trust contained a clause requiring my written approval before the property could ever be transferred or sold. Without my signature, every agreement Daniel had made was worthless. But there was a problem. Daniel had apparently told the lender that my signature was already secured. The lender was now demanding repayment. If Daniel could not produce proof of ownership within 48 hours, they would begin legal action against him. I sat back and realized why he had been so desperate to get me out. He had not wanted peace. He had wanted time. James looked at me and said, "You have two choices. You can expose everything immediately, or you can let Daniel believe his plan is still working." I asked him why I would ever choose the second option. James opened one final envelope. "Because your wife left instructions for exactly this situation." Inside was a short handwritten note from her. I read the first line and my hands went completely still. "William, if Daniel ever tries to take your home, do not stop him too quickly. Let him reveal everyone standing behind him." I read my wife's note again, trying to understand what she had known before she died. James explained that she had quietly investigated Daniel's finances months before her death. She had discovered that Claire's family was pressuring him to sell the house because they needed the money to cover their own debts. "Your wife suspected they would eventually try to use you as the obstacle," James said. I felt a deep sadness. Margaret had always believed our son had a good heart, even when his choices worried her. Now I understood why she had protected the house so carefully. James told me that we could send Daniel a legal notice immediately, but I stopped him. No, let him think he still has a chance. The next morning, I received a message from Daniel. "Dad, we need to talk. You cannot keep treating my wife this way." I almost laughed. Even after everything, he was still pretending this was about Claire. I replied only, "I will meet you tonight." That evening, I returned to the house. Daniel opened the door with a nervous smile. Claire was sitting in the living room, and her father was there too. I immediately understood what they were doing. They wanted to pressure me into signing something. Daniel placed a document on the table. "Dad, this is just a transfer agreement. Sign it and we can stop fighting." Picked up the document and pretended to read it carefully. It transferred ownership of the house to Daniel. "You want me to sign this?" I asked. Daniel nodded. "It is better for everyone." I looked at Claire's father. He would not even look at me. I slowly placed the document back on the table. "All right," I said. Daniel's eyes widened. "You will sign?" I smiled. "Tomorrow morning." They all looked relieved, but they did not know that James was already preparing something that would arrive at the house before sunrise, and more. Eviction order, not for me, but for the people who had been living in my property without my permission. The next morning I met James outside the house, just before sunrise. He handed me a sealed envelope and said, "Everything is ready." I looked at the document inside and saw the official eviction order. It was not addressed to me. It named Daniel, Claire, and Claire's father, requiring them to vacate the property because they had no legal ownership or right to transfer it. I told James I did not want to humiliate my son. I wanted him to understand what he had done. We waited until Daniel opened the front door. The moment he saw James standing beside me, his face changed. "Dad, what is he doing here?" I handed him the envelope. He opened it, read the first page, and immediately looked at Claire. "What is this?" Claire's father stepped forward and demanded to know why an eviction order had been issued. James calmly explained that the house belonged to the family trust, and every document Daniel had signed claiming ownership was legally invalid. Daniel looked at me, completely shocked. "You knew?" he whispered. I nodded. I knew everything. He began explaining that he had only borrowed the money because Claire's family had promised they could sell the property and make everyone wealthy. I stopped him. "You did not make one mistake, Daniel. You made a plan." Claire started crying and blamed her father, while her father blamed Daniel. Within minutes, the three of them were arguing about who had promised what. I stood there silently, realizing that my wife's warning had been right. She had wanted me to let them reveal themselves. Then James handed me another document. "There is one more thing, Mr. Harper." I opened it and saw the name of the lender. My heart sank. It was not a private company at all. It was a corporation owned by someone I had known for years, someone who had recently visited my son. I looked at James and asked, "Who owns this company?" He answered quietly, "Your son's uncle." I stared at James, unable to believe what I had just heard. "My brother?" I asked. He nodded and explained that Daniel's uncle had created the loan company specifically for private family investments. But according to the documents, he had not simply lent Daniel money. He had been advising him on how to acquire my property. I turned toward Daniel. "Did you know your uncle was behind this?" Daniel looked away. That silence was enough. He finally admitted that his uncle had told him the house was the easiest way to solve their financial problems. He said you were getting old. "Dad," he said, "you would not need the house forever." Those words hurt more than the eviction order ever could. I had spent my life protecting my family, and now several people were quietly planning what to do with my home after I was gone. James then revealed something that changed the entire situation. The loan agreement contained a hidden clause, stating that if Daniel failed to repay the $3 million debt, the lender could pursue the people who had helped arrange the transaction. That included Claire's father and Daniel's uncle. Suddenly, everyone who had been pushing Daniel to take my house had a reason to keep him silent. I looked at Daniel and said, "They did not help you, son. They used you." He began crying, but I was not ready to forgive him yet. Then my phone rang. It was the trustee of my wife's family trust. "Mr. Harper, we have completed our review," she said. "There is evidence that your son and several other people attempted to fraudulently transfer the property." I asked what would happen next. Her answer shocked me. "The trust is prepared to take legal action against everyone involved." I looked at Daniel, who was standing silently in the doorway. For the first time, he seemed to understand that this was no longer a family argument. It had become a legal battle, and the evidence was about to expose exactly who had planned everything from the beginning. The trustee's words left the room silent. Daniel looked at me, then at the documents in James's hands. "Dad, please. I never thought it would go this far." I looked at him and asked, "Then what did you think would happen?" He had no answer. James placed copies of the messages between Daniel, Claire's father, and Daniel's uncle on the table. They had discussed the house, the loan, and even how they would convince me to leave. One message from Claire's father made everything clear. "Once William is gone, the property is ours." Daniel covered his face with his hands. He finally admitted that he had known about the plan, but he insisted that he never expected them to actually force me out. I told him that was not an excuse. "You stood at my table and told your own father to leave his home. You cannot pretend. You were only following someone else's plan." Then James received another call. The lender had discovered that the property was protected by the family trust, and the $3 million loan was now under investigation. Daniel's uncle was being questioned, and Claire's father was being forced to explain why he had submitted documents claiming Daniel owned the house. But then the trustee revealed something none of us expected. "Mr. Harper, your wife anticipated that your son might eventually make this mistake. She created one final protection." I asked what it was. The trustee explained that if anyone attempted to steal the property, ownership would remain with me permanently. But I would also receive complete authority over another family asset, worth nearly $18 million. Daniel looked at me in disbelief. "Mom left you that too?" I nodded. Then I looked directly at him. "Your mother did not leave me money, Daniel. She left me protection from the day you forgot what family meant. But before we could leave, the trustee said one more thing. There is still one person who has not been identified in this case, and your wife knew his name. The trustee's final words made my heart sink. Who is the person? I asked. She opened a sealed file and placed an old photograph on the table. I recognized the man immediately. It was Claire's older brother, Michael. He had worked with my family years ago, and I had trusted him enough to give him access to several financial records. James looked at me and said, Michael was the one who provided Daniel with copies of the old property documents. I felt betrayed all over again. Michael had known exactly how the family trust worked, which meant he knew Daniel could never legally own the house. Yet he had helped them create documents that made it appear otherwise. The trustee then showed us a letter from Margaret. She discovered Michael's involvement before she passed away, she explained. My hands trembled as I read my wife's words. She had written that if Michael ever became involved in an attempt to take the property, I should not confront him myself. Instead, I should allow the legal process to expose everything. For months, Margaret had been quietly protecting me from people I thought were family. I looked at Daniel and asked, Did you know Michael was involved? He shook his head. No, Dad, I swear I did not. For the first time, I believed him. He had made terrible choices, but it became clear that other people had been manipulating him because they knew he was desperate for money. I told James to proceed with the legal action against everyone involved, but I asked him to make sure Daniel had the opportunity to cooperate with the investigation. He needs to face what he did, I said, but I do not want revenge. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. After everything I did, why are you still protecting me? I answered quietly, because you are still my son. But protecting you does not mean protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Then, James received one final message from the trustee. The investigation had uncovered the complete plan, and the evidence was enough to determine exactly who had started the scheme. Tomorrow morning, we would finally learn the truth. The trustee's final words made my heart sink. Who is the person? I asked. She opened a sealed file and placed an old photograph on the table. I recognized the man immediately. It was Claire's older brother, Michael. He had worked with my family years ago, and I had trusted him enough to give him access to several financial records. James looked at me and said, Michael was the one who provided Daniel with copies of the old property documents. I felt betrayed all over again. Michael had known exactly how the family trust worked, which meant he knew Daniel could never legally own the house. Yet he had helped them create documents that made it appear otherwise. The trustee then showed us a letter from Margaret. She discovered Michael's involvement before she passed away, she explained. My hands trembled as I read my wife's words. She had written that if Michael ever became involved in an attempt to take the property, I should not confront him myself. Instead, I should allow the legal process to expose everything. For months, Margaret had been quietly protecting me from people I thought were family. I looked at Daniel and asked, Did you know Michael was involved? He shook his head. No, Dad, I swear I did not. For the first time, I believed him. He had made terrible choices, but it became clear that other people had been manipulating him because they knew he was desperate for money. I told James to proceed with the legal action against everyone involved, but I asked him to make sure Daniel had the opportunity to cooperate with the investigation. He needs to face what he did, I said, but I do not want revenge. Daniel looked at me with tears in his eyes. After everything I did, why are you still protecting me? I answered quietly, because you are still my son. But protecting you does not mean protecting you from the consequences of your choices. Then, James received one final message from the trustee. The investigation had uncovered the complete plan, and the evidence was enough to determine exactly who had started the scheme. Tomorrow morning, we would finally learn the truth. The next morning, James and I arrived at the trust office, where the trustee finally revealed the full investigation. The person who had started the entire scheme was Michael. He had convinced Daniel that my house could be transferred, helped him obtain the false documents, and encouraged Claire's family to provide the $3 million loan. He had even planned to profit from the sale. Daniel sat silently, listening to everything, until he finally turned to me and said, Dad, I am sorry. I was so focused on money that I stopped seeing you as my father. I told him that apology was only the beginning. The legal process continued. The false documents were canceled. The property was protected, and everyone involved had to face the consequences of their actions. Daniel eventually moved out of the house and began rebuilding his life without depending on anyone's money. Claire and her father disappeared from our lives, while Michael faced the consequences of the evidence against him. Months later, Daniel came to my home with nothing but a small box of family photographs. He placed it on the table and said, "I cannot give you back the years I wasted, Dad, but I want to spend whatever years I have left making things right." Looked at the photograph of Margaret sitting between us and remembered her final warning. She had not been trying to protect a house. She had been trying to protect our family from what greed could do to it. I forgave Daniel, but I made one thing clear. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting. From that day forward, our relationship slowly changed. He started visiting me without asking for money, without talking about property, and without expecting anything in return. One evening, as we sat together drinking coffee, Daniel looked at me and said, "Dad, you were right. That house was never worth losing my father." I smiled and answered, "Then you finally learned what your mother wanted you to know." And for the first time in years, I felt that Margaret's plan had finally worked. She had protected my home, exposed the truth, and most importantly, given my son one last chance to understand what family really means.